Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm excited to introduce our presentation on research types. The title of our session is Research Types, and we'll also look at some key aspects related to this topic. Over the next few slides, we'll explore different kinds of research, their purposes, and how they are applied. So let's get started and dive into the fascinating world of research methods. Let's talk about observational research. Essentially, this is when researchers observe subjects and measure outcomes without actually assigning any treatments, interventions, or exposures. The researcher's role here is quite passive. They're mainly collecting data on what naturally happens without trying to influence the situation. For example, you might track patients who are already on certain medications, or conduct natural history studies of diseases to see how they progress over time. Cohort studies looking at lifestyle factors are also a common form of observational research. One of the main strengths of this approach is that it reflects real-world conditions very well. It's particularly useful for studying rare diseases or situations where intervening might be unethical or risky. However, a key limitation is that, because we're not controlling variables as in experimental studies, it's hard to prove causation definitively. There are often confounding factors that can influence the outcomes, so we have to interpret the results carefully. Interventional studies, also known as clinical trials, are a key part of research where researchers actively assign participants to different groups. This is done to test a specific intervention, which could be a drug, a device, or a therapy. The role of the researcher here is quite active. They control the treatment or exposure that each group receives. For example, one group might receive a new drug while another gets a placebo, or they might test a new surgical technique. The main strength of these studies is that they can provide very strong evidence of cause and effect relationships. This is especially true when they use randomization and control groups, like in randomized controlled trials. However, it's important to recognize their limitations too. They can be quite costly and take a lot of time to conduct. Plus, sometimes they raise ethical concerns or might not be practical for certain research questions. Understanding interventional studies helps us see how researchers actively test interventions to find out what really works, which is central to advancing medical knowledge and improving patient care. Let's take a closer look at the differences between observational and interventional studies. In an observational study, the researcher takes a passive role, simply observing what happens without interfering. This means there's no control over variables, and everything occurs naturally. Because of that, these studies are generally less costly and can be completed more quickly. In contrast, interventional studies involve the researcher actively intervening, often to test a specific treatment or exposure. This active role allows for high control over variables, which is key when trying to establish cause and effect relationships. For example, in randomized controlled trials, randomization helps ensure that groups are comparable and that the results are reliable. Another important point is causality. Observational studies can show an association or correlation between variables, but they can't definitively prove causation. Interventional studies, especially randomized controlled trials, are designed to do just that. They can demonstrate causality. Ethics also play a significant role. Observational studies can safely examine potentially harmful exposures, like pollution, because no one is being intentionally exposed. However, interventional studies are limited by ethical considerations. They can't assign harmful exposures to participants. Finally, there's the aspect of cost and time. Observational studies tend to be more affordable and faster to conduct, making them useful for initial insights. Interventional studies, on the other hand, often require more resources and can take years to complete, but they provide stronger evidence of cause and effect. So, understanding these differences helps us choose the right approach depending on our research question and ethical considerations. Let's take a closer look at descriptive studies. These are often the first step in research, and they help us get a detailed picture of a situation, a population, or an event. Essentially, they answer the basic questions of who, what, where, and when. For example, you might want to know what percentage of teenagers in Delhi are using e-cigarettes. That's a typical descriptive question. The main goal here is to document and describe how a condition or characteristic is distributed within a group. It's not about testing a hypothesis yet, but rather about gathering information that can lead to formulating hypotheses later on. It's important to note that in these studies, there's no comparison group. You're looking at one group or one event in isolation, just observing what's happening without comparing it to something else. Some common examples of descriptive studies include case reports, which focus in detail on a single patient with a rare or new symptom. Then there are case series, which look at a small group of patients with similar symptoms. And finally, cross-sectional surveys, where you conduct a poll asking a population about their current health status at a specific moment in time. All these methods help us to understand the scope and nature of a particular issue or condition, which is a critical first step before moving on to more complex analytical studies. Now let's move on to analytical studies. These studies go a step beyond just observing. They try to understand the reasons behind what we see. They focus on the why and how, examining the relationship between an exposure, like a habit or environment, and an outcome, such as a disease. The main goal here is to determine if there's a cause and effect relationship or simply an association. For example, we might ask, does e-cigarette use lead to lung irritation? These studies are specifically designed to test a hypothesis, meaning they start with a question or a theory and then investigate it systematically. A key aspect of these studies is the comparison group. You need to compare people with the exposure or disease to those without it to see if there's a difference. For instance, in a case control study, you compare people who have a disease, called cases, to those who don't, called controls, and look back at their history to find potential causes. Alternatively, in a cohort study, you follow a group of healthy people over time to see who develops a condition based on their lifestyle or exposures. Both types of studies help us piece together the puzzle of how exposures affect health, which is essential to the overall goal of understanding risks and causes in public health. Now, let's take a closer look at the differences between descriptive and analytical studies, as summarized in this table. First, consider the main questions they address. Descriptive studies focus on the who, what, where, and when, essentially. They help us understand the basic characteristics and patterns in the data. Analytical studies, on the other hand, aim to answer why and how, digging deeper to uncover causes and relationships. Next, look at the comparison group. Descriptive studies usually don't require a comparison group. They simply describe what's observed. Analytical studies, however, always include a comparison group, which allows us to test hypotheses and examine differences more rigorously. Moving to the primary goal, descriptive studies are about describing patterns and generating hypotheses. They give us a snapshot of the current situation or trends. Analytical studies, by contrast, are designed to test those hypotheses and find actual causes behind observed patterns. In terms of direction, descriptive studies often provide a snapshot, looking at the now or current state. Analytical studies can be more flexible, looking backward into the past or forward into the future to understand cause and effect relationships. Now, for the output. Descriptive studies typically produce measures like prevalence, incidence, and trends, which tell us about the scope and distribution of a condition. Analytical studies produce measures such as relative risk, odds ratios, and correlations, which help us understand the strength and nature of associations. Overall, these differences highlight how descriptive and analytical studies complement each other. Descriptive studies set the stage by showing us what's happening, while analytical studies help us dig into why it's happening and how we might intervene. Together, they form a comprehensive approach to understanding health phenomena and guiding effective decision-making.